When people ask me how to think like an innovator, they usually expect some kind of secret formula, a hack, or a motivational quote that will magically unlock creativity. But the truth is, it comes down to something deceptively simple and yet incredibly rare. The discipline of thinking from first principles. Most people don't actually think. They copy. They rely on analogy, on precedent, on the way things have always been done. They say, well, this is the standard, this is the industry norm, this is what others are doing, so we'll just do a slightly better version. That's reasoning by analogy, and while it feels safe, it almost guarantees mediocrity. First principles thinking, on the other hand, strips away assumptions and digs into the fundamental truths of a problem, the physics of reality that no opinion or tradition can change. It's asking, what do we know for certain? What is indisputably true? And if we start from there, what becomes possible? This way of thinking is the reason rockets are being reused today instead of thrown into the ocean, the reason electric cars are mainstream instead of niche, and the reason solar energy is expanding beyond rooftops into entire power grids. Take the example of Tesla's batteries. In the early 2000s, if you asked experts whether an electric car could be viable, they would have laughed. Battery packs cost hundreds of dollars per kilowatt hour, they'd say. Too expensive, too heavy, not practical. They were reasoning by analogy. They assumed because batteries had always been expensive, they would remain expensive. But when I looked at the problem, I asked a different question. What are the fundamental components of a lithium-ion battery? What do they cost on the commodity market? When you break it down, a battery is just a collection of metals like nickel, cobalt, aluminum, lithium, graphite, and some polymers for separation. If you bought those raw materials on the London Metal Exchange, the cost per kilowatt hour wasn't astronomical. The high cost came from the way batteries were being assembled, the lack of economies of scale, the legacy processes that hadn't been rethought in decades. That's when I realized the barrier wasn't physics, it was thinking. If we built gigafactories, re-engineered production, and scaled manufacturing, we could drive costs down to a level that made electric vehicles not just competitive, but superior. And that's exactly what happened. Tesla wasn't born from wishful thinking. It was born from first principles. The same applied to rockets. Before SpaceX, launching anything into orbit cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Why? Because every rocket was treated as disposable. Imagine if you had to throw away a 747 after every flight. Airline tickets would cost millions too. The industry shrugged and said, that's just how it island. But from first principles, it didn't make sense. Rockets are made of aluminum alloys, titanium, carbon fiber, and advanced electronics. None of that magically evaporates after one flight. The fundamental truth is that a rocket is a machine that can withstand extreme forces. If you design it properly, test relentlessly, and solve the landing challenge, you can fly it again. People said it was impossible until they watched Falcon 9 boosters land on a drone ship in the middle of the ocean. Now, reusability is becoming the new standard. Again, the breakthrough didn't come from copying what NASA or Boeing was doing. It came from asking, what does physics allow? And why aren't we doing that? First principles thinking isn't just for rockets and batteries. It applies to everything: your business, your health, your relationships, your entire life. The human brain is lazy by default. It prefers shortcuts, patterns, and rules of thumb. That's why we're creatures of habit. We accept assumptions because they reduce mental effort, but the cost of that convenience is limitation. You accept ceilings that don't really exist. You settle for problems that could have been solved. Think about your own career. How often do you say, that's just the way it is? Maybe you've said it about your income, your opportunities, your circumstances. But what if that phrase is the very cage holding you back? What if you stripped away the assumptions and asked, what is actually true? Here's how you practice first principles in your daily life. Step 1. Identify assumptions. Write down what you or others believe about a problem. For example, I can't start a business because I don't have capital. Step 2. Break it down. Ask, what does it actually take to start? Do I need a fancy office? Or just a laptop and an internet connection? What are the real irreducible needs? Step 3. Rebuild. Once you see the core truths, construct a solution that doesn't rely on inherited assumptions. Suddenly, what felt impossible reveals multiple pathways. People often ask, why do so few think this way if it's so powerful? The answer is simple: it's uncomfortable. Thinking from first principles means admitting you don't know as much as you thought. It means questioning authorities, traditions, and even your own beliefs. It feels destabilizing. Most people prefer the comfort of consensus to the discomfort of truth. But history doesn't remember consensus thinkers. It remembers those who broke patterns. Look back at innovators from any era: Edison, Einstein, Jobs. None of them accepted, "That's just how it island." They asked, "What if?" And then they built answers from the ground up. That mindset is available to everyone, but it requires courage. Courage to be misunderstood, to look foolish, to fail publicly. Because when you're thinking in ways others haven't, the first response is always skepticism. People mocked Tesla, doubted SpaceX, ridiculed the idea of colonizing Mars. But physics doesn't care about ridicule. Reality bends to those who align with its truths, not its traditions. Think about what's at stake if you don't adopt this mindset. You'll live your life inside invisible walls, fighting for incremental gains in systems that were designed decades ago. You'll waste energy competing instead of creating. You'll optimize a path that never should have existed in the first place. But if you embrace first principles, you open doors no one else sees. You stop asking, "How can I be better than them?" and start asking, "How can I make them irrelevant by building something entirely new?" That's how industries shift, how fortunes are made, how progress accelerates. I'll give you another example. Solar energy. People used to dismiss it as too expensive, too inefficient, too unreliable. But when you look at the fundamental truth, the sun hits the earth with more energy in a single hour than humanity uses in an entire year. That's physics. That's abundance. The only challenge is capturing and storing it. So instead of asking, "Is solar good enough compared to coal or gas?" the real question is, how do we align our systems with the ultimate energy source we already have? That shift in perspective is why Tesla Energy exists. First principles also apply to personal growth. Ask yourself, why do you believe what you believe about yourself? Are you assuming you're not smart enough, not talented enough, not connected enough? Break those assumptions down. What's the fundamental truth? That you can learn, adapt, and improve. That effort compounds over time. That resilience beats talent. Once you see those truths, the excuses collapse. This is not easy thinking. It's not comfortable. It requires effort, discipline, and the willingness to confront your own blind spots. But the payoff is exponential. Every great leap forward in history has come from someone who refused to copy the past and instead asked, "What's possible if we start from scratch?" That someone could be you. So I challenge you. Look at the biggest problem in your life or in the world and strip it to its core. Forget what experts say. Forget what tradition says. Ask, what do the laws of physics, economics, or human nature actually demand? And if I rebuilt from there, what would I create? That's first principles. That's how you stop living by limits and start engineering breakthroughs. When people talk about risk, they usually describe it as something to avoid, something dangerous, something that could take away what you already have. But if you look at the way real breakthroughs happen, you'll notice that risk isn't the enemy. Risk is the price of admission for doing anything extraordinary. If you try to live without risk, you're choosing safety over possibility, comfort over progress, and eventually stagnation over growth. Most people think risk is about gambling blindly, but real risk is actually calculated courage. It's looking at a situation, stripping it down to first principles, and asking, what's the worst that can happen? What's the best that can happen? And does the potential upside outweigh the downside? That's how I approached PayPal when everyone thought online payments were too insecure. That's how I approached Tesla when people said electric cars were dead. That's how I approached SpaceX when people said private companies had no chance of competing with government space agencies. Every one of those ventures looked reckless from the outside, but from the inside, they were risks worth taking because the upside was revolutionary and the downside was survivable. You see, risk is relative. Driving to work every day is risky, but no one thinks about it because they've normalized it. Starting a company feels risky because people imagine catastrophic failure, but in reality, if you're young and adaptable, the worst case is you fail, learn a ton, and start again with more experience. What's truly risky is not trying at all, not taking the shot, not putting yourself in the position to grow, because the opportunity cost of a safe life is a wasted life. The world advances because people are willing to bet big on themselves, to embrace risks that others avoid. If you look at human history, every leap forward required someone who was willing to take a risk everyone else thought was crazy. Crossing oceans, flying planes, splitting the atom, landing on the moon. None of that happened by accident. It happened because people looked at impossible odds and said, we're going anyway. That's the mindset you need if you want to do something meaningful. People often ask me how I deal with fear when taking risks. And the truth is, I don't eliminate fear. I just don't let it paralyze me. Fear is natural. It's a signal that you're stepping outside your comfort zone. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. When SpaceX faced 3 failed launches, fear was everywhere. Investors doubted, employees were exhausted, and critics laughed. But I knew we had one more shot, and if we got it right, it would change everything. The fourth launch succeeded, and it saved the company. That risk could have destroyed us, but without taking it, there would be no SpaceX today. Risk and reward are two sides of the same coin, and the bigger the risk, the bigger the potential reward. But here's the catch. Risk only pays off if it's aligned with reality. Blind risk is suicide. Intelligent risk is strategy. That's why first principles matter so much. When you understand the fundamental truths of a problem, you can take risks that others can't even see, because you've calculated the real odds instead of being fooled by surface-level assumptions. Think about Tesla again. The risk wasn't just building electric cars. The real risk was betting that consumers would change their behavior, that they would accept charging stations instead of gas stations, that they would value sustainability alongside performance. That required not just technology but a shift in culture. Most people wouldn't take that bet. They thought it was too risky. But from first principles, the risk was actually necessary, because the alternative was a future destroyed by fossil fuels. Some risks you take not because they're comfortable, but because they're essential. That's the difference between personal ambition and mission-driven risk. If your risk is only about making money, you'll quit when it gets hard. But if your risk is about solving a real problem, you'll keep going because the mission is bigger than your fear. That's how you find the courage to stay in the fight when everyone else walks away. Another thing most people misunderstand about risk is that it compounds just like wealth. The more you take risks, the more resilient you become. Every time you fail and survive, your tolerance for uncertainty grows. Every time you take a leap and land on your feet, your confidence in your ability to adapt increases. That resilience becomes an asset no one can take from you. The first time you take a big risk, it feels terrifying. The 10th time, it feels normal. That's why entrepreneurs, inventors, and explorers seem fearless. They're not fearless. They're just trained by experience to know that even when things collapse, you can rebuild. So how do you start taking risks in your own life? You don't have to quit your job tomorrow and launch a rocket company. Start by asking where you're hiding behind comfort. Where are you letting fear dictate your choices? Maybe you've been sitting on an idea for years because you're afraid of failure. Maybe you've avoided a hard conversation because you're afraid of rejection. Maybe you've settled into a routine because it feels safe, even though you know it's slowly killing your potential. Those are risks you need to confront. The risk of speaking up, the risk of starting small, the risk of being vulnerable, the risk of choosing growth over stagnation. Every big breakthrough begins with a small act of courage. People also forget that risk is not just about what you lose, but about what you gain. When you take a risk and it works, you don't just win the reward. You expand your identity. You prove to yourself that you're capable of more than you believed. That expansion is priceless because it redefines what you consider possible. The person you become through taking risks is far more valuable than the outcome itself. Even if the business fails, even if the relationship ends, even if the project doesn't work out, you walk away with a new level of resilience, creativity, and strength. That's why I always say failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the training ground for success. Risk is the gym where you build the muscle of persistence. And just like in the gym, the weight feels heavy at first, but over time, you grow strong enough to lift things that once crushed you. The future belongs to those who embrace risk, because the future is by definition uncertain. If you're waiting for perfect certainty before you act, you'll never move. The world will pass you by, and you'll be left wondering why nothing changed. But if you accept that uncertainty is the playground of progress, then every risk becomes an invitation to grow. You start to see challenges not as threats but as opportunities. You stop asking, what if I fail? And start asking, what if I never try? That shift changes everything. Let me put it this way. In the short term, playing it safe feels comfortable. In the long term, it's the most dangerous strategy of all. Playing it safe guarantees regret. because when you look back, the opportunities you didn't take will haunt you far more than the failures you endured. So if you want to live a life without regret, you have to take risks. Smart risks, bold risks. Risks that align with your mission and your values. Risks that stretch you beyond what you thought possible. That's where greatness is born. Every time I've bet big on myself, the world said I was crazy. But if you're not being called crazy, you're probably not aiming high enough. Risk is the signal that you're on the edge of something meaningful, and that edge is exactly where growth begins. When you think about innovation, most people imagine it as some lightning bolt moment when an idea suddenly strikes and everything changes. But that's not how it really works. Innovation is not magic, it is the disciplined practice of breaking problems down to their smallest parts and rebuilding them from the ground up using what I call first principles thinking. Instead of reasoning by analogy, most people look at what already exists and then copy it, maybe improve it a little, and call it progress. But that's not innovation, that's iteration. Real innovation requires you to strip away assumptions, question the so-called rules, and ask what is actually true and what is just habit. Take rockets, for example. When I first looked at the cost of launching payloads into space, the price was astronomical. People assumed it had to be that way because that's the way it always was. But when we broke it down into first principles, we asked, what are rockets made of? What are the raw materials? And what do they cost? The surprising answer was that the materials themselves were only about 2% of the price of a finished rocket. So why was it so expensive? The answer was inefficiency, outdated processes, bureaucracy, and a culture of assuming. Things couldn't be done differently by questioning those assumptions. We found ways to cut costs and design reusable rockets. Everyone else thought it was impossible until it wasn't. That's the power of first principles when you start from truth instead of tradition. You unlock possibilities no one else can see. This approach applies far beyond rockets or cars. It applies to every area of life and business. When Tesla started, people told me it was impossible to make an electric car that was both fast and desirable. The assumption was that electric cars had to be slow, boring, and ugly, because the early attempts were exactly that. But if you ask from first principles, is it possible to create a car powered by electricity that outperforms gas cars? The answer is yes. You just need to engineer the battery systems and the drivetrain to match the vision. Once we solved that problem, the narrative changed. Suddenly, electric cars weren't toys anymore. They were the future. This is why I tell people stop asking, what's been done? Ask what is possible when stripped to fundamentals, because once you see reality clearly, you realize how many limits are self-imposed and how many barriers are illusions. People often underestimate how powerful the human mind is when it refuses to accept defaults. Your mind can build bridges where others see walls. It can see futures where others see dead ends, but you have to train it to think differently, to question, to refuse easy answers. One of the greatest dangers to progress is reasoning. By analogy, it sounds reasonable, but it traps you in the past. For example, people said rockets are disposable because airplanes used to be disposable in the early days of aviation. But eventually someone asked, why throw away the whole plane when you can repair it and fly again? The same logic applied to rockets. If we can land and reuse them, space travel becomes dramatically cheaper, and that single insight changes the trajectory of humanity toward becoming multiplanetary. Think about your own life. How many assumptions are you carrying that are holding you back? Maybe you believe success has to take decades. Maybe you believe you need permission before you start. Maybe you think failure is fatal. All of those are assumptions, but are they true if, and you break them down? Most are not. They are inherited beliefs passed from one person to another until they feel like facts. But they are not facts. They are cages. The only way to escape those cages is to return to first principles, strip away in the noise, and ask, what do I know for sure? What is undeniable? Physics doesn't lie, math doesn't lie, reality doesn't lie. When you anchor yourself in truth, you can build anything, but when you anchor yourself in tradition, you inherit limits that are not yours. Most people never challenge them. That's why most people never innovate. Innovation is not about IQ, it's about courage. The courage to look foolish, the courage to stand alone, the courage to keep asking why when everyone else has stopped. If you think about every breakthrough in history, it was created by people who refused to inherit assumptions. The Wright brothers were not supposed to fly. Edison was not supposed to light up the night. Jobs was not supposed to put a computer in. every pocket, but they all did because they started from fundamentals, not from fear. This is what separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. When you live by analogy, you live in the shadow of others. When you live by first principles, you create a future that never existed before. Now, here's the paradox. Most people admire innovation, but they resist innovators. They like the products, but they don't like the process because the process feels uncomfortable. It requires you to say no to common sense, to push against convention, to keep moving forward even when the experts laugh at you. But that resistance is proof that you are on the right path. If everyone already agrees with your idea, it means you are not innovating. You are repeating. True innovation will feel uncomfortable because you are standing in a place no one else has dared to go yet. That's where growth is waiting. The key to making innovation practical is iteration. You don't just dream, you build, you test, you fail, you learn, you adapt, and you keep going, people. Imagine that innovators have perfect ideas from the start, but the truth is we iterate our way to greatness. Every failed rocket test, every broken prototype, every rejected idea was not wasted. It was data, it was the feedback we needed to refine the system. Innovation is not one giant leap. It is 1,000 small steps taken with relentless persistence that eventually look like a leap in hindsight. So when people ask, how do I become innovative? The answer is simple. Stop being afraid of failure. Stop worshiping assumptions. Start asking better questions. Start building even when you don't have all the answers. The act of trying reveals truths that sitting still never will. That's why I say, don't just plan, build, don't just think, act, don't I just wonder test, because motion creates momentum, and momentum uncovers opportunity. This applies to everything from technology to personal growth to solving global problems, climate change, energy, poverty, disease. None of these will be solved by repeating what's already been done. They will be solved by minds that refuse to accept the default, by people willing to challenge the baseline and say, what is actually true, what is actually possible. Those are the innovators, those are the builders, those are the people who change the trajectory of humanity. And here's the final point. Innovation isn't just about solving problems, it's about expanding the horizon of what it means to be human. It's about asking not just how do we survive, but how do we thrive? How do we push the boundaries of existence? How do we take humanity from a single planet species to a multiplanetary one? How do we design systems that outlast us? How do we leave the world better than we found it? That's the real purpose of innovation. It is not about gadgets or profits or headlines. It is about possibility. It is about creating a future that generations after us will inherit and say they were brave enough to question and bold enough to build. And because of that, we are here today. So if you want to innovate, don't start with imitation, start with truth. Strip it down to first principles, rebuild it from the ground up, and never accept that just because something has always been done one way, that it must always stay that way. That's not truth, that's inertia. And inertia is the enemy of progress. Innovation is the antidote, and it is available to anyone willing to think differently. When we talk about risk, most people instinctively recoil because risk sounds like danger, failure, loss. But, and here's the truth, without risk, there is no reward, no innovation, no progress. Everything worthwhile that humanity has ever accomplished has come with enormous risk. And the reason most people stay average is not because they lack talent or intelligence, but because they refuse to step into uncertainty. They want guarantees before they move, but guarantees are an illusion. The only real certainty is that if you never take risks, you will remain exactly where you are. I've lived my entire career surrounded by risk, from starting Zip2 when everyone thought online maps were useless, to betting everything on PayPal when e-commerce was still seen as a fad, to putting my last money into Tesla and SpaceX when both were on the verge of collapse. I had to choose between saving one and letting the other die. There were no guarantees, just decisions and consequences. And in those moments, I realized something powerful. Risk is not the enemy. Risk is the price of admission to greatness. What most people get wrong about risk is that they think it means reckless gambling, jumping blindly without thought. But that's not risk, that's stupidity. True risk is calculated. It's about stripping things down to the fundamentals and then deciding if the potential upside is worth the possible downside. For me, the upside was always clear. A world with sustainable energy, a multiplanetary species, a future where humanity doesn't destroy itself by stagnation or fear. And the downside was simple, personal: failure, bankruptcy, embarrassment, even ruin. When you weigh those against the future of humanity, the choice becomes obvious. The problem is most people think too small. They see risk only through the lens of their own comfort, their own reputation, their own convenience. They ask, what if I fail? But they rarely ask, what if I succeed? What if this crazy idea actually works? What if this attempt actually shifts the trajectory of history? When you start asking that question, risk becomes less about danger and more about opportunity. It becomes fuel. One of the greatest lessons I've learned is that resilience is born in the fire of risk. When you put yourself in situations where failure is possible, you activate parts of yourself that would never wake up in safety. You learn faster, adapt quicker, and think deeper because you have no choice. You are forced to evolve, and that pressure creates strength. Just like steel is forged under heat, risk forges greatness. Without it, you stay soft, you stay untested, you stay ordinary. I remember when SpaceX had its first three launches fail. Each one cost tens of millions of dollars, and each failure pushed us closer to total collapse. People said we were insane to keep going. The media laughed, the experts said rockets would never be reusable, but in that crucible of failure, we learned more in a few years than NASA had learned in decades. We had to innovate because survival depended on it. If everything had worked the first time, we would have never been forced to push so hard and discover what was actually possible. The fourth launch succeeded, and it changed everything, not because we avoided risk, but because we embraced it. The same is true in life. Your willingness to risk determines your capacity to grow. Every and rhyme. Comfort you cling to is a chain. Every time you avoid risk, you avoid the chance to stretch into the person you are meant to become. And here's the paradox. The more you take smart risks, the less risky life becomes. Why? Because you build resilience, you build experience. You build the ability to handle setbacks, so what looks terrifying to others becomes normal to you. The person who has fallen and gotten back up 100 times no longer fears falling. The person who has risked everything and survived no longer fears loss. The courage compounds until risk becomes fuel, not fear. And this is exactly what separates entrepreneurs, builders, innovators from everyone else. We don't see risk as something to avoid. We see it as the landscape to play on. We know that every breakthrough, every company, every invention was once labeled too risky until it wasn't. Think about it. People thought electricity was dangerous. Railroads were too risky. Airplanes were impossible. The internet was a joke. Electric cars were like doomed. Space travel was fantasy. And yet, every one of those so-called risks became the foundation of the modern world. If history teaches anything, it is this: the bigger the risk, the bigger the opportunity, and the ones willing to take it shape the future. And the part most people miss: risk doesn't have to be random. It can be engineered just like rockets. Risk can be designed, managed, and optimized. You do this by running simulations in your mind, by asking, what are the worst outcomes? What are the best outcomes? What variables can I control? What must I accept by doing this? You demystify risk, you strip it of its emotional fog and turn it into data. Then you make decisions based not on fear but on facts. I use this thinking every day, whether it's in engineering or in business or in life. If the risk of inaction is greater than the risk of action, then the choice is clear: act. Because waiting, pretending that safety will somehow appear, is the biggest risk of all. Safety is an illusion. Life itself is a risk. Every day you wake up and step outside, you are risking something. So the real question is not, will you risk, but will you choose risks that matter, or will you waste your life on meaningless safety? Net's another truth about risk is that it reveals your values. What you are willing to risk for is a mirror of what you actually care about. People say they want success, but they aren't willing to risk comfort. They say they want freedom, but they aren't willing to risk stability. They say when they want impact, but they aren't willing to risk rejection, so they stay trapped. The willingness to risk is proof of seriousness. It is the currency you pay for transformation. If you are unwilling to risk, you are unwilling to grow. And if you are unwilling to grow, you will never achieve anything beyond mediocrity. One of my favorite concepts is asymmetric risk, which means situations where the downside is limited, but the upside is massive. That's where innovation thrives. That's where startups are born. That's where lives are transformed. You risk a small investment of time or energy, but the potential payoff is exponential. But you have to be willing to step into it, because the window for asymmetric opportunities always closes. Those who hesitate miss it, and spend the rest of their lives watching others reap the rewards. So my challenge to you is simple. Ask yourself, what risks am I avoiding right now? What fears are keeping me in the same place? What opportunities am I ignoring because I want certainty? And then flip the question, what future am I forfeiting by refusing to take those risks? Because that is the real danger, not the failure, but the lost future. The roads not taken, the innovations not built, the lives not changed, the legacy not written. The truth is, risk is not something to run from, it is something to run toward, because within it lies the only path to growth. Every dream you have will require risk. Every breakthrough humanity will ever achieve will require risk. The only question is whether you will be one of the few willing to step into it, or one of the many who watch from the sidelines. Risk is the test that separates those who want from those who will. It is the bridge between vision and reality, furnace that forges conviction, the fuel that powers transformation. So don't fear risk. Embrace it, engineer it, learn from it, because it is the greatest teacher you will ever have. And once you do, you'll realize that risk was never the enemy. It was always the doorway to everything you wanted. People often talk about vision as if it's some mystical gift reserved for a chosen few, but vision is not magic. It's clarity. It's the ability to see a future that does not yet exist, and to believe in it so strongly that you are willing to endure pain, ridicule, and failure until it becomes reality. Most people don't lack intelligence. They lack vision. They see only what is right in front of them, the next paycheck, the next weekend, the next distraction. But vision demands that you look further. It demands that you lift your eyes above the noise and imagine what could be, not just for you, but for humanity. Vision is what allows a person to keep moving forward when everything else says stop. When Tesla was on the brink of collapse, when SpaceX had failed 3 launches, when the press was mocking me daily and investors were fleeing, the only thing that kept me going was vision, the picture of a future where cars no longer poison the planet, where rockets could land and fly. Again, where humanity could live beyond Earth. Vision made the impossible necessary, because once you've seen it in your mind, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending that the old way is enough. Vision creates obsession, and obsession creates resilience. Without vision, you give up at the first sign of resistance. With vision, you see resistance as confirmation that you are moving in the right direction, because anything that shakes the status quo will trigger friction. The problem is that most people confuse goals with vision. A goal is something you check off. A vision is something that shapes your identity. A goals are external achievements. Vision is an internal compass. A goal might be to make $1 million, but a vision is to build something that changes how people live. Goals end when you achieve them. Vision never ends. It evolves, it expands, it pulls you forward into spaces you never thought possible. And here's the truth. Vision is contagious when you carry it with conviction. It infects the people around you. It draws in those who would have otherwise stayed indifferent. It gives them a cause bigger than themselves. People don't rally behind paychecks. They rally behind purpose. They don't fight for a balance sheet. They fight for a future worth believing in. This is why companies with vision outlast companies without it. When SpaceX was close to shutting down, the engineers stayed not because of salaries, but because of vision. They wanted to be part of something that mattered, something that would be remembered 1,000 years from now. That's the power of vision. It turns jobs into missions, it turns employees into warriors, it turns setbacks into stories of persistence. Vision is also a filter. It shows you what deserves your time and what doesn't. When you are clear on where you are going, distractions lose their power. You stop wasting energy on every shiny object because you know what fits into your future and what doesn't. Without vision, everything looks like an ever-best opportunity. With vision, only a few things do, and that clarity saves you from drowning in noise. One of the most important aspects of vision is that it must be rooted in first principles, not in tradition, not in assumptions, not in what everyone else thinks is realistic, but in what is actually possible. If you can break a problem down to its fundamentals and then build it back up from there, vision is no longer fantasy. It becomes engineering. When we set out to build reusable rockets, most said it was impossible. But we didn't ask what has always been done. We asked what is true about physics, about materials, about energy. And once you anchor vision to truth, it doesn't matter how many people say it can't be done, because the math, the science, the logic is on your side. The vision anchored to reality is unstoppable. It may take years, decades, even lifetimes, but it will win because reality always bends to persistence, combined with truth. But vision alone is not enough. It must be married to execution, otherwise it becomes delusion. Too many people are visionaries in their minds, but cowards in their actions. They dream big but act small. They talk about the future, but refuse to risk the present, and so their vision dies as fantasy. You must be willing to act like your vision is already real, to behave as if the future you see is inevitable, to put your time, money, energy, and reputation on the line for something no one else can see yet. That is the price of vision. If you are not willing to pay it, your vision is only entertainment. One of the most misunderstood truths about vision is that it is often lonely at the start because, by definition, you are seeing what others cannot yet see. If everyone agrees with your vision, it's not vision, it's consensus. Vision looks crazy until it works. And during that period of disbelief, you will face ridicule, betrayal, rejection, and doubt, not only from strangers, but from friends, family, even yourself. The question is, will you hold the picture of the future so clearly in your mind that you can endure the fog of the present? Will you carry it like a fire that refuses to go out, no matter how much the storm rages around you? The vision is also not static. It grows with you. The vision I had for Tesla in the beginning was simply to prove that electric cars could be cool. Now the vision is to transform the entire global energy system. The vision for SpaceX started with cheaper rockets. Now it is about making life multiplanetary. That's the nature of vision. It expands as you expand. And this is why people with vision never really arrive, because arrival is an illusion. Every milestone simply reveals the next horizon. Vision is infinite, and that's what makes it so powerful. It keeps you alive, it keeps you restless, it keeps you building when others have stopped. If you are struggling right now, wondering why your life feels empty, why your work feels meaningless, why your energy feels scattered, the answer may not be motivation or discipline. The answer may be vision, or rather, a lack of it. Without vision, you will always feel like you're chasing something undefined. Because you are without vision, you are at the mercy of circumstances, blown around by trends and opinions. With vision, you become the one setting the direction. You become the one shaping circumstances. You become the gravitational force, pulling others into your orbit. This is why the Bible says, without vision, the people perish. It's not poetic, it's practical. Without vision, life decays, energy dissipates, purpose fades. But with vision, everything comes alive. So I challenge you today, stop asking, what do I want? And start asking, what do I see? What future do I see so clearly that I am willing to risk everything to bring it into reality? What world do I believe in so deeply that you cannot leave it undone? When you answer that, you will know your vision, and when you know your vision, you will know your path, because vision is the blueprint of destiny. When we talk about the future, we are not simply talking about technology or profits, we are talking about survival and direction. We are talking about whether humanity will rise to meet the challenges that could destroy us, or shrink back into comfort and distraction until it is too late. The truth is, progress has never been guaranteed. History shows us civilizations that rose and fell, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked urgency. They delayed, they ignored warning signs, they consumed more than they created, and eventually they collapsed. So, when I speak about urgency, I don't mean panic, I mean clarity. A mindset that refuses to wait for ideal conditions, because ideal conditions don't exist. Waiting is the greatest enemy of progress. Think about it. If SpaceX had waited until rockets were cheaper or safer, or until everyone agreed it was possible, we would have never launched Falcon 1. If Tesla had waited for the automotive industry to embrace electric cars, we would still be decades behind where we are now. Everything worth building. He began before it was comfortable, before it was certain, and before the majority supported it. Urgency is the engine that drives vision from theory into reality. Without urgency, ideas remain trapped in notebooks and whiteboards. Urgency is not about speed for the sake of speed, it is about momentum. Momentum compounds, it takes small wins and stacks them into breakthroughs. The reason most people never see their dreams materialize is not because they lack intelligence, but because they fail to act with urgency. They tell themselves they have time, they can start tomorrow, but tomorrow becomes next week, then next year, and eventually never. The people who change the world understand that time is not infinite. They understand that delay is the most expensive cost of all. Urgency forces you to prioritize, to strip away what doesn't matter, to focus relentlessly on what moves the needle forward. When you live with urgency, you stop indulging in distractions, you stop seeking constant validation, you stop over analyzing because you realize energy spent. Hesitating is energy stolen from progress. Urgency is the antidote to fear, because fear thrives in hesitation. When you delay, fear grows. It convinces you to wait until you are more prepared, more experienced, more supported. But when you act with urgency, fear has no space to expand. You are already in motion, already learning, already adjusting. Urgency also creates resilience, because when you act quickly, you expose yourself to reality. Faster reality teaches faster than theory ever could. And with every iteration, you grow stronger and smarter, more capable. It is not failure that destroys people. It is waiting so long that by the time they fail, they have no time left to recover. Urgency solves this by forcing you into cycles of action, feedback, and growth. While others are still debating whether to begin, urgency is not recklessness. It is alignment with reality, because reality is moving. Whether you act or not, the world does not pause for your preparation. Markets shift, technology evolves, problems compound while you hesitate. This is why urgency is essential. If you want to make an impact, the asteroid doesn't wait. Climate change doesn't wait. Disease doesn't wait. Artificial intelligence won't wait for humanity to be ready. These forces are accelerating, and our only hope of keeping pace is to act with a level of urgency that matches the scale of the threats we face. Imagine you are building a rocket. You know at some point it has to launch. You could spend a decade polishing every bolt, but the only way to know if it works is to launch it, test it, adapt it. Urgency pushes you to launch, to get feedback from reality, to embrace iteration over perfection. The same principle applies to your life. How many of your dreams have? I've been sitting on the launch pad for years, waiting for you to feel ready. Here is the truth. You will never feel fully ready, because readiness is not a state you reach. It is a state you create. By moving, urgency is about recognizing that the perfect time is an illusion. The only perfect time is now. Urgency forces you to ask hard questions. What am I building? What problem am I solving? What matters so much that I am willing to endure discomfort and risk? Because if you cannot answer those questions clearly, then you are probably wasting time. Urgency gives clarity, because when you feel the clock ticking, you no longer have patience for trivial pursuits. You start allocating energy only to what matters most. Urgency also inspires others, because urgency is contagious. When people see you moving, when they see you refusing to delay, they feel the gravity of your momentum. It wakes them up from complacency. It forces them to consider whether they too are wasting time. History's great movements were not driven by people who waited for consensus. They were driven by individuals who acted with urgency, despite opposition and doubt. This is why urgency creates leadership. Leadership is not about titles, it is about pace. The leader is the one who moves first, who carries the vision into action. Before it is fashionable or safe, urgency makes you that person. Urgency also requires sacrifice, because you cannot move urgently while carrying every distraction and comfort. You must let go of some things. You must endure criticism, rejection, and uncertainty, because urgency doesn't leave time for endless approval cycles. It doesn't leave room for everyone to agree. Before you move, it demands that you trust your conviction more than the crowd. Urgency means choosing progress over popularity. It means being misunderstood in the short term for the sake of long-term impact. Most people fail, not because they lack talent, but because they choose comfort over urgency. They think they can outsmart time, but time is undefeated. The only way to partner with time is to respect it by moving now. So the challenge is this. What is the launch you have delayed? What project, what decision, what change have you postponed because you told yourself it wasn't the right time? If you are honest, the only reason you are waiting is fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss. But urgency reframes failure as feedback, judgment as noise, and loss as tuition for growth. Urgency doesn't ask, "Are you ready?" It asks, "Are you willing?" If you are willing, then you move, and by moving, you become ready. So understand, this urgency is not optional. It is the price of relevance in a world moving this fast. Delay is decline, urgency is the law of progress, and if you ignore it, it will be left behind. The future will not wait for you. The question is, will you wait for it, or will you move now? People often think legacy is something that happens after you die, but legacy is built in the choices you make every day. It is not carved on a tombstone. It is etched into the systems You create the ideas you spread and the people you impact. Too many live as if legacy is a future concern, but the truth is, you are writing it now. Every decision, every action, every refusal to quit. To becomes part of the story others will tell about you long after you are gone. Legacy is not about wealth or fame because both can vanish. It is about influence, about whether you left the world more capable, more advanced, more inspired than you found it, if you want to. Understand legacy. Think about the people who changed history. They didn't just accumulate, they contributed, they didn't just consume, they created. They built bridges not just for themselves, but for future generations. When I think about SpaceX, I don't just think about rockets. I think about what happens when children grow up knowing humans can live on two planets. That mental shift changes everything. It redefines what they see as possible, and that ripple effect becomes legacy. Tesla isn't just cars. And it's a signal to the world that sustainable energy can be mainstream. And once that idea takes root, you cannot kill it, even if Tesla disappeared. Tomorrow the world has been altered. That's legacy. The real question you must ask is what ideas? They will outlive you. What systems will continue to operate long after you are gone? What spark will remain burning because you dared to strike the match? Legacy requires you to live bigger than yourself, to stop optimizing only for comfort and start building for continuity. The temptation is to measure life by short-term wins, but those fade. What endures is whether you created momentum strong enough to keep rolling without you. Think about this every time you mentor someone, every time you document your knowledge, every time you build something scalable. You are building legacy because you are transferring not just results but resilience to the future. Your name will eventually fade, but your impact can become immortal if it is embedded in structures that outlast you. So, stop thinking of legacy as a retirement plan and start treating it as a design principle. Ask yourself daily, will this action outlive me? If the answer is no, then ask why you are spending time on it, because the clock is ticking. And the only way to beat time is to build what time cannot erase. Legacy is not about statues or headlines, it is about systems you build that continue long after you are gone. Most people think of legacy as reputation, but reputation is temporary. It fades as soon as attention shifts. True legacy is impact. It is the structure you leave behind, the path you carve, that others can walk on without starting from zero. The reason Tesla matters is not because of my name, but because it accelerated the path, adoption of sustainable energy. The reason SpaceX matters is not because of rockets themselves, but because it opened the path to multiplanetary life. Legacy is not the story told about you, it is the future enabled because of you. So ask yourself right now, what the systems are you building that will last beyond your own time? What ideas are you turning into realities that your children or their children will benefit from? The temptation is to think legacy is something for later, once you are older, once you are successful, once you have more resources. But the truth is, legacy begins the moment you decide to align your actions with something larger than yourself. Every day you are either building a legacy of consumption, distraction, and wasted potential, or a legacy of courage, innovation, and progress. Legacy is not optional, it is inevitable. The question is what kind. You will leave. Urgency without direction is noise, but urgency tied to purpose becomes legacy. This is why I always think in terms of the first principles, because when you strip away distractions and focus on what is undeniably true, you are not just solving today's problems, you are building foundations for tomorrow. Your legacy is the compounding effect of those foundations. Over time, remember, most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 10. Legacies are built in decades, not days, but they start with choices made now, one brick, one launch, one risk at a time. Never underestimate the power of consistency, because consistency is the architect of legacy. If you want to know your legacy, ask what would still stand if your name disappeared, if your face was forgotten. Would the systems you built, the solutions you created, the lives you touched continue to function? If the answer is yes, then you are already building legacy. If the answer is no, then it is time to shift your focus, because legacy is not built on applause, it is built on contribution. The real test of your life is not what you accumulated, but what you set in motion. So as you think about your next move, don't just ask, will this make me money? Ask, will this matter in 50 years? Will this still be relevant when I am gone? Because if the answer is yes, then you are not Just living you are, building forever.